Masechet Ketubot Daf Pe Gimel. We begin the 9th perek. We're continuing the topic of nichse melog. That's property that the wife brings into the marriage or inherits during the marriage, and she retains the title, although the husband gets the rights to the fruit during the marriage. That's one right he has. A second right he has is that he will inherit. If she dies first, he inherits the property. There are restrictions, however. Both the husband and the wife are prohibited from selling the land during the marriage. She cannot sell it because he has claim to it. He has claim over the fruit, and he cannot sell it because it belongs to her and is going to go to her at the end of the marriage, should he die first. Okay, now we're going to talk about cases where the husband wants to relinquish some or all of his rights to her property. Maybe this is part of the negotiation for whatever reason. Hakoteb lishto din udvarim en li benichsayich. He says, I have no legal dealings, no law or words with any of your property. So sounds like he's just distancing himself. You keep everything. Even though he said that, nevertheless, he still has a right to consume the produce during her lifetime. And if she dies, he still inherits. So he still keeps both of those rights. So now you're wondering, Imken lama katav la din udvarim en li benichsayich. So what does this mean when he says, I have no legal dealings with your property, if he still keeps both of those rights? And it applies to the following, Shim machra v'natna kayam. What he's granting her is that if she wants to sell it or gift the property away during the marriage, that transaction is valid. Normally, it would not be valid because he says, hey, I have a claim. You brought this into the marriage. Your title is yours, but I get to use it during the marriage and I get to inherit it. So he'll still get to use it and inherit it. It's just that she has a right to sell it because he wrote that formula into the ketubah. Now, let's test another formula. Katav la din udvarim en li benichsayich ubeferotehen. If he adds another word in the ketubah and says, I have no legal dealings with your property, nor with its produce. So in that case, indeed, he does give up the right to the produce. He can't come and change his mind later and says, no, I want the produce. She can look at the ketubah here. It says, you said you're not going to take the produce. Nevertheless, once she dies, he still can inherit. He doesn't give that up. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Leolam ochel pere perot ad sheichtov la din udvarim en li benichsayich ubeferotehen perotehen ad olam. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if he says, I'm giving away my rights to the produce, the husband can still enjoy the produce of the produce. That would mean that she has this land, it has produce. Let's say she gets it. She takes that produce, she takes the money, and she puts it in some investment, another piece of land, and that land itself produces produce that the husband can get because he only excluded the produce, but not the second step produce. But if he writes, I have no legal dealings with your property, with this produce, or with the second generation produce forever, only then, if he writes that, would she be able to keep that second, third generation produce. Now, next formula. Katav la din udvarim en li benichsayich ubeferotehen perotehen bechayech ubemotech. This is now a full formula. I have no dealings with you or your property, not their produce, not the produce of the produce, not in your lifetime and not after your death. That's what he writes in the ketubah. In that case, eno ochel perot bechayeh havimeta eno yorsha. Then he does not have any of the produce, and not the second or third generation, and if she dies, he does not inherit. The land will go to her, back to her family. And that is the opinion of Tanakama. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, meta yirashena mipnei shematnei ma shekatuv b'Torah v'chol hamatnei ma shekatuv b'Torah tenao batel. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees regarding the inheritance part. He says if she dies, he does inherit it, even though he said, I have no dealings with you or with this property even after you die. The reason is because this would be a condition that contradicts a law in the Torah. The laws in the Torah talk about inheritance law, and the rabbis derive from the word she'er, that the husband inherits from the wife. And so if someone makes a stipulation against the Torah, the stipulation is void, and that's why he gets the land nevertheless, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, now the Gemara has gonna add one piece of information here. Taneh Rabbi Chiya ha'omer leishto. There's a braita Rabbi Chiya taught that's the same as our Mishnah, except it says the word ha'omer instead of kotev. And this comes to teach us that he doesn't actually have to write it in a document, in the Ketubot or other document. He can even just say it orally, and it will have the very same effect. Okay, now we ask about both the oral or written formula. How does this work? Even if he wrote it, well, it shouldn't work, because let's compare it to a partnership. והתניא, העומד לחברו, דין ודברים אין לי על שדה זו, ואין לי עסק בה, וידי מסולקת ממנה, לא אמר כלום. Let's say you have two people that are partners in a certain property, and one of them doesn't want to deal with it anymore. I don't know, maybe there's some lawsuits, maybe there's some problems, a leak, whatever. He just wants out. And so he tells his friend, I have no legal dealings regarding this field. I have no business with it. My hand is removed from it. Even if he says that, it does not accomplish anything, because he's just saying words. He didn't do an exchange. Anytime if you want to transfer the land, fine, do some kind of exchange, like a kinyan chalipin. You transfer a handkerchief or anything of any value, symbolic exchange, and then so I'm giving up my right to this. You give me a handkerchief, and then you take the right. Fine, if you do an actual exchange, good. But if you just say, hey, I have no dealings with this land, doesn't do anything. And so in our case also, just because the husband says or writes, it doesn't matter, I have no dealings with this land, it shouldn't matter. He should still have a right afterwards to come and say, yeah, that's nothing. I still have a right to come and take the produce and inherit, because he didn't do an actual exchange. Okay, here's the answer. Amri deber b'chiyanai bekotev la ve'oda arusa kederab kahana. So Rabbi Yanai explains that our Mishnah is talking about a case where he wrote this while they are still only did kiddushin before nisuin. During that time period, it didn't yet transfer to the husband. So you're right. If they're partners, that would be the same as if they already did nisuin. In that case, already doing nisuin are like partners. It's interesting that it's like partners, even though she retains the full title to the land, but he is kind of like a sharecropper. Even more, he has all the rights to the produce and also will inherit. So it's a kind of a partnership, and so that you cannot you renounce your share of the partnership just with words or in writing. Even in writing, until you actually do a kinyan. That's true. But before the nisuin, before the marriage, it didn't yet come into his domain at all. He's not yet a partner. So before that, he can say, I refuse to accept the partnership of your land, and that will work even if you just write it, even if only with words. You don't need it to do a kinyan. So that's what our Mishnah is talking about. And this is supported by Rav Kana. Damar Rav Kana, Nachala ba'ale adam makom acher adam matneh aleha shelo yirashen. If a person is going to get an inheritance, falls to a person from some other place, a rich uncle dies, and he's going to inherit, he can say, I will inherit on condition, and put whatever condition that he doesn't want to fully inherit. That's fine. He's allowed to do that. But once he already owns it, if he's already in a partnership, then he cannot just relinquish his responsibilities and rights to it. It's also supported by a statement of Rava, where if someone says, I opt out of an ordinance of the sages. The sages did something for a person's benefit, like here, where the sages said that the husband gets to enjoy the produce of the land, and that's for his benefit, so he can use the produce to feed and enhance the household. If he says, thank you very much, rabbis, for doing that, but no thanks, I want to opt out, we listen to him. He can do that. So it means that he does have a right to do that, but only before it comes to him, before the nisuin. And so that is the explanation of the Biyanai. All right, now that we quoted Rava, who said, like this, he was referring to like something. What case was he referring to? Mai kegon zo, Rava was talking about an example of a woman who says to her husband, I will feed myself, and I am not working for you, meaning my wages will not go to you. It's true, the rabbis made a takana for the benefit of a woman, that the husband has to feed her, provide for her, and in exchange he gets her wages. And usually that's a good deal for a wife, so it benefits the wife. But if you have a woman who has a high-paying job, and she says, I'll take care of myself, I'd rather be independent financially, I keep my wages, you don't have to feed me, that's her right to reject what the rabbis instituted for her. Now we ask, wait a second, if Rava's statement is true, and the person can anytime reject what the rabbis did for their benefit, then even after they're married, how come the husband can't say, from now on, even after the marriage, you know what, you keep your property, I don't want the produce. Why can't he say that? After the marriage, Amar Abaye nesua yadot ki yada. Abaye explains that once they're married, his hand is like her hand, meaning he takes a partnership in the land. And so this is different from her, because of her saying, you keep your food, I'll keep my wages. There's no land that they're partners over. Each day is another deal. Every day she brings her wages from that day, whatever she made, and he gives her a sandwich. So it's not a partnership, but rather an ongoing agreement, and therefore she can opt out at any time. Whereas with the land, once they're married, the land becomes partly his, and therefore he cannot relinquish it just by saying so. He would have to do a more formal kinyan. Rava amar yado adifa miyada. Rava says not only is it equal, actually his access, his part of the partnership is even greater than hers. Even though she retains the title, he is the one that makes decisions and takes the produce. He can't sell it, but he can decide how he wants to use the land. So in fact, he has an even greater share. So certainly, he cannot just give it up by saying so. Nafka mina l'shemeret yavam. What's the difference between Abaye and Rava? There has no nafka mina in the case of a marriage, because according to both, he cannot give up his share just by saying so. So the only difference between them would be if the husband dies without children, and then so now the estate falls somewhere in between. It could go to her, it could go to him, depending, are they going to do yibum, are they going to do chalitza? And if she dies during that time period, then what happens? We saw in the previous perek, this is a machloket between Bet Shammai, says they split it evenly, Bet Hillel, that different things get split in different ways. And so it's in this, regarding that machloket and how to interpret it, Abaye would say they have equal shares. Rava would say he has greater access to it. That's the difference between their two opinions. But regarding here, just the regular marriage case, they agree that he cannot relinquish his rights just by using words. Okay, Ibai Lehu, question. Kanu miyado mahu. What if now going back to the partnership case, there's nothing to do with our Mishnah or marriage, just two partners, and one wants to relinquish his responsibility and rights over this land that they own together. What if, you just said he can't just say so, but what if they do a kinyan? They do a kinyan chalipin, one gives a handkerchief to the other says, by accepting this handkerchief, I relinquish my rights, it's your land. Is that valid or not? Amar Rav Yosef, midinu devarim kanu miyado. Rav Yosef says, no, this is the same as just saying, I relinquish my legal rights to the land, and when he says that, it doesn't do anything. So this handkerchief only concretizes the words that themselves don't mean anything. So therefore, the act is meaningless. The idea is that person doesn't really have in mind that he wants to completely divest himself of the property. He just doesn't want to be responsible for it, but he doesn't have in mind to completely transfer the property, so therefore it does nothing. Rav Nachman Amar migufa shel karka kanu miyado. Rav Nachman disagrees and says this is a proper transaction. You can transfer land with this kinyan chalipin, this symbolic exchange, and the very land itself transfers to the other guy, and the one who gave it away cannot get it back. Amar Abaye, mistabera milta de Rav Yosef be'orer. So Abaye makes a compromise between them and says, I think Rav Yosef's ruling that nothing happens makes sense in a case where ored, he's awake, he immediately is awake. That means that let's say I relinquished the rights to you. I took the handkerchief. I said, I don't want to have any dealings with this anymore. And then you go and you take the land, right? You go and fence it in, and you start using it, building something on it. And now, if I immediately I'm immediately awake, and I say, hey, that's my land, that shows that I really did not want to relinquish totally my share of the land. And so, in that case, that shows that Rav Yosef is right, and that kinyan, the handkerchief deal, that really didn't do anything. But the same circumstance happened. You come and you fence in my share, and you put a lock on it. I have no access to it, and I wait around for a few days, and I don't even do anything. That reveals that I really did have in mind to completely transfer my ownership of the property. And so in that case, indeed, like Rav Nachman says, it is a full transfer. So really, it depends on one's mindset, and you can reveal what one's mindset was based on their actions later. That's what Abaye says. Amar Amemad, Hilchata Megufa Shel Karka Kanu Miyado. Amemad says the bottom line halacha is this does work. If you just say so, it doesn't work. But if you do a kinyan, chalipin, then the actual land transfers, and I cannot come after and claim my land back and say, hey, now I want, you go and sell it for double the price. I can't come and say, hey, I want my share. No, I gave it away. Amar le Rav Asher Amemad, be'ored or be'omed. Rav Asher asks Amemad, are you saying that your halacha across the board, no matter what, that the transfer happens, or only if I don't say anything for a few days, right? Are you agreeing completely with Rav Nachman, or are you agreeing with the compromise position of Abaye? Now, what would be the difference? Rav Yosef. The difference would be Rav Yosef in Abaye's interpretation, who said that Rav Yosef makes sense only if I object right away, but not if I don't object right away. So, Amemar, what did you mean? He said, I never heard of that. I never heard of Abaye and his compromise. I never heard of that explanation and limitation of Yosef, meaning he does not, even if he did hear about it, he doesn't agree with it. So, Amemar said, across the board, if you do a kinyan with a handkerchief, that actually does transfer the land itself. We now analyze the next phrase in the Mishnah. It says, Im ken lama katav la. Once again, he said, I have no dealings with your property. And while that sounds like it's across the board, the Mishnah says, no, that he can still inherit, he can still get the produce. We assume the minimal interpretation that's only referring to one right, and that's her right to sell the land. That by saying the statement, I have no dealings with you, that gives her the right to sell or gift the land that otherwise she wouldn't have. Now we ask, how come we're interpreting it in the minimum way? This is written in the document, in the Ketubot. How come the wife can't come and say, look, it says here, you have no dealings with it. Therefore, go away. You don't take the produce. You do not inherit, right? Because it can have a maximal interpretation too. So why can't she give the maximum interpretation and take all that? Amar Abaye, Yad Bal Hashtar ala Tachtona. Abaye says the one holding the document, that's her, right? She's holding the Ketubah. Her hand is at a disadvantage. In other words, he'll come and claim, I only meant the minimum interpretation of it, and she would have to prove that he meant more than that. The burden of proof is on her, and therefore we take the minimal interpretation. All right, now we're going to ask, How do you know that the minimal interpretation is in fact referring to her right to sell? Maybe it's talking about produce. Ve'ema mi pere. How come she can't come and say, or weren't you talking about the fruit? After all, that seems like a more minimal interpretation, the fruit of the land, rather than her right to sell the entire piece of land. So if we're assuming the minimal interpretation, she should be able to say, hey, I'm going to keep the produce. Amar Abaye, Bosina tav mikara. A good expression to remember always. A cucumber is better than a gourd. Meaning, this is the same as a cucumber in one's hand. A small fruit is better than a gourd that's big, but you're going to have to wait longer for it. This is like saying a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. A person would rather have the produce now, even though it's less than the amount of the whole field, rather than he would rather have that rather than the right of the possibility that she might sell the whole land later. It's true, she might sell the whole land later, and that would be a bigger loss, but he'd rather not lose out on the immediate gratification of taking the produce now, and therefore, in actuality, the minimal interpretation is her right to sell the land, because a person would rather have the produce, although monetarily the produce is worth less. Okay, ve'ema mirusha. Wait a second, why don't we say the minimal interpretation is the inheritance? After all, that's going to happen after a very long time. Amar Abaye, mita shechicha, mechira la shechicha. Death is common. There's a 1 out of 2 chance that she will predecease him, and therefore he will be able to get it. So he doesn't want to give away a right that 50% chance he will get. Whereas sale is not so frequent. It's only a smaller chance that she will decide that she wants to sell her land that she brought into the marriage with. She's probably not going to want to sell that. And when a person has to remove himself from some right, see, this is all part of some negotiation. They said, hey, I'll agree to the marriage. She says, if you relinquish some right to the land that I'm bringing in, fine. So if he could pick the right, he's always going to pick the minimal one, and he's always going to pick the one that is less common rather than the one that's more common, right? And something's uncommon, you don't even think about it. You don't take flood insurance because what are the chances there's going to be a flood? Whereas things that are more common that you worry about. And so that's why the inheritance is worth more to him. The least valuable item of the 3 is her ability to sell. Davashe amar b'nichsayich velo miperotehen b'nichsayich velo la'achar mita. Davashe has a different explanation than Abaye. He says this phrase itself, he says, I'm going to have no din or devarim in your property. So property implies the land and not the produce, and property implies the land, the right to sell the land. It doesn't mean inheritance. And so since he said the words property, that the word themselves, it's not just because it's the minimum of the 3, but because that itself implies the right to sell the land. Good. Rabbi Yehuda omer le'olam hu ochel pere perot. Rabbi Yehuda says that if a husband wrote, I relinquish the rights to your property and its produce, then it's true, he cannot have the first generation produce, but he can have access to the second generation produce. Let's analyze this. Tanur Banan. Eluhen perot, eluhen pere perot. What's the definition of first generation and second generation produce? Hichnisa lo karka ve'asta perot, harehen perot. If she brings land into the marriage and they produce fruit, that's the first generation perot. Machar perot velakach mehen karka, asta perot, harehen pere perot. However, if he sells the fruit and buys land with it, and that land itself produces fruit, then that is the second generation produce. So by saying he relinquishes his right to first generation, she'll get that first generation, but if she doesn't actually eat it itself, but he reinvests it, he can get the second generation reinvestment. Okay, Ibai Lehu, question. L'Rabbi Yehuda, pere perot davka, or dilma ad olam davka, or dilma tarvaihu davka. So Rabbi Yehuda then followed up his statement that said, if a man does want to renounce all rights to the fruit first and second and future generations, he has to write, I relinquish my right to the land and its perot and pere perot ad olam. So he has to write both of these phrases, pere perot ad olam. That's what we're asking. According to the Yehuda, does he really have to write pere perot? Or is that the key phrase and ad olam is just giving us an explanation? Or does he really have to write ad olam, up to infinity, and pere perot is optional? Or maybe he actually has to write both the second generation, pere perot, and he has to write ad olam up to infinity if he wants to give away everything, all generations, that he has to write both phrases. Okay, that's the question. Which phrase is the key one or the other, or both? So now we're going to go through all three possibilities and explain the logic. We're not going to have an answer to this. These are three legitimate explanations to the wording of Rabbi Yehuda. Im timsi lomar pere pero davka. So option one is, what all he has to write if he wants to really give up everything is, I'm giving up pere perot. Good. And that implies all generations. So in that case, ad olam lamali. So how come Rabbi Yehuda said the word ad olam in the Mishnah? Hakamash malan keban de katav la pere perot ke man de katav la ad olam dameh. The words ad olam are just a commentary. As long as you write pere perot, it's as if you wrote for infinity, but all you need is the first phrase. Okay, second possible interpretation. The main phrase, key phrase you need is forever. But all you have to write is, I give up the perot ad olam. And you don't need to write pere perot. So in that case, how come in the Mishnah it does say pere perot lamali? Hakamash malan afagav de katav pere perot I katav la ad olam in I la la. No, the Mishnah includes the words pere perot to teach you that even if you wrote pere perot, you still need ad olam. So if you wrote ad olam, it's good. If you wrote pere perot without the word olam, then it will not go on to infinity. It will only include the second generation, and that's it. So the word pere perot is there to teach us that it itself is insufficient. So by adding the word ad olam, it shows pere perot by itself is insufficient. Okay, third possibility. If you want to say, for all generations, you have to write pere perot and you have to word the right ad olam. So tarter lamali. So why would I need both? Siricha di katav la pere perot lo katav ad olam. Hava amina pere perotu de la achil aval pera de pere perot achil la achis terich ad olam. Okay, I need both phrases, because if I only write pere perot and now don't write forever, then I would think that only means that he cannot have the second generation, but the third generation and on, the husband can eat. That's why indeed he needs the clarification, and you need to write the words ad olam. V'katav la ad olam v'lo katav la pere perot hava mina le'olam aperot ka'eh lahachis terich pere perot. And if he just writes, I relinquish my rights to perot ad olam, and skips the middle phrase, then I would interpret the olam to mean time-wise. I has been saying, I relinquish my rights to the fruit forever, right? For many, many years to come, no matter how long it is, no matter how much fruit. And I would not assume that it's referring to generations of reinvested income. So that's why I have to write pere perot. That's how I know it's talking about produce of produce, and the olam therefore is not a time that it goes on forever, but rather any amount of generations of reinvestment. All right, those are three possibilities. We do not answer which one it is. But we do have another question. Katav la din udevarim en li benichsaich ubepere perot mahu sheochal perot. Until now, we were assuming that he was writing, I have no dealings with your property or its fruit or the fruit of its fruit. But what if he leaves out the fruit part, the first generation? He only says your property and the second generation fruit. Then what about the first generation fruit? Is that implied or excluded? Mi pere perot salik nafsheh. Certainly the husband then cannot have, he removes himself from the second generation fruit. Mi pere la salik nafsheh. And therefore, do we say on the one hand, he did not relinquish himself from the first generation fruit, so he can have it. Or does he mean by that he excludes himself from all the produce, both the first and the second generation. The second generation including the first. That's the question. Let me try to answer it. It seems obvious that he's removing himself from both the first and second generation. Because if you think that he's only removing himself from the second generation, but he keeps the first, so that means he's going to consume and take the first generation. Since he's consuming all the first generation, how will there ever be a second generation? If he eats all the olives of the first generation, then there's not going to be any olives left to go and sell them and buy land and have second generation produce. So it must be that he means all generations, because you can't have a second generation without a first generation. Okay, that's a good logic, but we reject it. Look, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah gives a case that's the opposite case, where he consumes the perot unless he writes for her, I relinquish perot and perot. Meaning, if he only says, I relinquish perot, so she can eat the perot, but he can have the second generation. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. So I'll ask you the same question about the very case in the Mishnah. If she eats the first generation of fruit, so, because that's what he said. He said, you can have the first generation, and Rabbi Yehuda says he keeps the second generation. Well, if she already consumed all the first generation, then there won't be anything left over. There won't be any second generation for him to take. So what is Rabbi Yehuda talking about? So obviously, Ella, you have to interpret it differently. Rather, it's obvious in the case of the Mishnah that there was left over. He said you can have the first generation, but she doesn't consume everything. There's some leftover. If that leftover gets reinvested, he can have the second generation. That's clear in the Mishnah. Same thing here in our case, where it's flipped. And he says, I relinquish rights to the second generation, so that means he's not relinquishing rights to the first generation. He's gonna consume the first generation, but if there's leftovers and they get reinvested, then the second generation he is not relinquishing, and that will go to her. So we can interpret it either way, and this question also is left unresolved. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.